their right to free speech and protest against India's unjust and undemocratic laws. But first, as always, we start our briefing with India Genocide News, a weekly roundup of the persecution of India's religious minorities. The National Investigation Agency conducted a massive raid on the popular Front of India offices and the homes of its members, arresting 45 people across 15 states, including Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and Rajasthan. They were arrested for alleged terror links due to their association with prominent Muslim organizations. In Madhya Pradesh, a Muslim man named Wajid Ali and his parents were brutally attacked for over an hour by a right-wing Hindu mob chanting religious slogans. In a video circulating on social media, Ali alleged that they were trashed due to being Muslim. They waited for over 2 days before police arrested 4 people in connection with the incident.
और अम्मी नकाब में थी, उनका नकाब फाड़ दिया गया। इसको भी बिल्कुल उड़ा देना चाहिए। इसमें से जितने भी लोग इसमें रहते हैं, उन्हें डिटेंशन सेंटर में भेज के।
Hindu supremacist leader Yati Narshinganand addressed a group of his supporters by calling for renowned educational institute Aligarh Muslim University to be evacuated and bombarded. He added that the students and individuals associated with the institution should be lodged in detention centers.
जहाँ उनके दिमाग का इलाज हो सके, वहाँ भेज के इस पूरी बिल्डिंग को ध्वस्त कर देना चाहिए, बमों से उड़ा देना चाहिए.
Muslims in Khargone who moved to the court against demolitions after Ram Navami violence are being harassed by officials to withdraw their pleas. Amjad Khan, who lost multiple businesses to the demolitions, alleged that he was told that the petition against him would be dismissed and his business licenses would be granted if he admitted his mistake in writing. Gujarati authorities filed new charges against human rights defender Teesta Setalvad in the latest attempt at judicial harassment of Setalvad, as well as whistleblowers and former police officers R.B. Srikumar and Sanjeev Bhatt. The charges include forgery for the purpose of cheating and fabricating false evidence. The BJP majority Karnataka Legislative Council passed a draconian anti-conversion law especially targeting Christians on September 16th. It will infringe on the freedom of religion guaranteed by the Indian Constitution. The law allows for a prison term of up to 5 years for an illegal conversion, which can extend to 10 years if it involves a minor. A study conducted by the Islamic Council of Victoria has found that internet users in India were responsible for a staggering 55.12% of anti-Muslim content on Twitter. Between 2019 and 2022, over 3 million anti-Muslim posts were made on the platform. The ICV has pointed to the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party as the main reason for hateful anti-Muslim content in India. TV news anchor and hate monger Suresh Shivanke is demanding the release of Dara Singh, a Hindu man who was sentenced to life imprisonment in the murder case for murdering a Muslim trader and a Christian priest.
इसका हनन हो रहा है, इसलिए मैं जेल के बाहर धरने पर बैठा हूं.
So at our briefing today, we are talking about 12 prisoners because they dare to challenge the Islamophobic citizenship law from Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Hindu supremacist government. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom A bipartisan independent federal panel has included these 12 human rights defenders in its freedom of religion and belief victim list. Most of these 12 leaders and 6 others were students when they were arrested in 2020 and slapped with bogus charges of terrorism under India's draconian Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. This law is one of the most undemocratic laws, as it allows for prolonged detention without trial, which is a complete violation of international laws. It has been repeatedly acknowledged by global civil society that these 12 prisoners of conscience are being punished only for their role in the protest against the Citizenship Amendment Act, widely known as the CAA, which was passed in 2019 with the sole intention to disenfranchise India's 200 million Muslims and rob them of their citizenship. We have with us a distinguished panel of speakers. We will be hearing testimonies from family members of the incarcerated activists, on-the-ground legal and activist analysis, as well as global human rights and academic voices, which will locate the persecution of the protesters in the growing criminalization of dissent and Islamophobia in India today. First, let us watch a short video. "2020, 18 students and activists are arrested for terrorism. 16 are Muslims. Their alleged crime, rioting and violence in Delhi. In truth, they have been jailed because they protested India's new citizenship law that could disenfranchise Indian Muslims. These prisoners of conscience are Sharjil Imam, Khalid Saifi, Tahir Hussain, Salim Malik, Muhammad Salim Khan, Miran Haider, Shadab Ahmed, Gulfisha Fatima, Taslim Ahmed, Shifa ur Rahman, Adhar Khan, Umar Khalid. 6 others have been bailed but are pending trial. Ishrat Jahan, Safura Zargar, Asif Iqbal Tanha, Natasha Narwal, Devangana Kalita, Muhammad Faizan Khan. On December 11, 2019, India's parliament passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, introducing a religious basis for citizenship, combined with the National Registry for Citizens that imposes a demanding requirement to prove citizenship. This makes Indian Muslims the most vulnerable to be stripped of citizenship. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has called the CAA fundamentally discriminatory and incompatible with India's international human rights obligations. The law's passage immediately triggered powerful nationwide protest. India's capital, Delhi, became an axis of the movement symbolized by the protest at Shaheen Bagh. Many students and activists arrested later led these protests. Hindu nationalist politicians of India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party called the protesters traitors. On February 22nd and 23rd in 2020, Hindu nationalist figures began mobilizing their supporters against anti-CAA protests in northeast Delhi. A BJP politician publicly threatened action which even the police will not be able to control. Hindu mobs appear on the streets of 23rd and violence erupts in northeast Delhi. 4 days of violence sees targeted attacks against Muslim and their homes, shops, and mosques. 53 people are killed, 40 Muslims and 13 Hindus. Over the next months, the police arrested hundreds. These 18 were charged as the masterminds of a conspiracy to defame India by engineering violence between Hindus and Muslims. They have been charged under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, or UAPA, which is India's most draconian anti-terrorism law that restricts legal rights and allows incarceration for years without trial. Several UN special rapporteurs condemned their arrest and demanded their release. The police are being called out for their case against the 18 arrestees. Judges, jurists, activists, and journalists have exposed recurring holes in investigations, including doctored statements, lack of evidence, and fabricated charges. The Delhi High Court has repeatedly cited the lack of any factual material in the charge sheets. Granting bail to an accused The court noted that despite the use of alarming and hyperbolic verbiage, the prosecution's case was based upon interference drawn by the prosecuting agency and not upon factual allegations. In another bail ruling, the court said, "We can discern no specific or particularized allegation, much less any material to bear out the allegation, that the appellant incited violence, what to talk of committing a terrorist act or a conspiracy or act preparatory to the commission of a terrorist act as understood in the UAPA." The police have not investigated the trail of hate speech and incitement of violence by Hindu extremist leaders. In violation of international and Indian law, as per his family, the police stripped Athar Khan and tortured him, making him sit on his haunches for hours and hold his ears as though begging for forgiveness. Most prisoners have reported that Islamophobic prison officials have harassed them by blocking medical care, family, and lawyer visits. Many have been assaulted by prison officials and fellow inmates. The international community must demand the immediate release of these 18 leaders and an end to the false and biased cases against them.
मेरे बेटे ने कुछ ऐसा काम नहीं किया जो इसके ऊपर मुकदमे लगा दिए, ना उसने संविधान के दायरे में रह करके लोकतंत्र को बचाने के लिए और इस देश के संविधान को बचाने के लिए के दायरे में उसने प्रोटेस्ट किया है।
To discuss the persecution of these 12 Muslims and the bogus case against them, I now invite Kavita Srivastava, one of India's veteran human rights defenders and a feminist activist who has been active for 4 decades in fighting authoritarianism and state repression. Kavita is the National Secretary of the People's Union for Civil Liberties, which is India's oldest human rights group. Kavita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this briefing. Just to continue with what you showed us via video, I'd like to speak very briefly on why these protests that happened post the amendment in 2019 December to the Citizenship Act of 1955, why were they so special? Just to once again bring to your notice that the 2019 amendment to the Citizenship Act provided for legalization and naturalization of the citizenship of illegal migrants from the Hindu, Christian, Jain, Parsi, Sikh, and Buddhist communities, all who were religious minorities and had fled persecution from 3 countries in the neighborhood, namely Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. It clearly left out the Muslims, saying that they have 54 countries where they can go. We don't need them here. This is so completely sectarian and against the Indian Constitution's core principle of equality of all persons that definitely there was outraged. It conveniently ignored claims of many other refugees from other neighboring countries like Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, Mauritius, and Burma. We have a huge, I mean, not so huge, but we do have about 40,000 Rohingya refugees, other than some other, Chen refugees and others. So this came in the backdrop of the terrible suffering that happened in Assam, where the National Register of Citizens happened, and more than 19 lakh people were left out of the register, and they were termed non-citizens, non-Indians. The Muslim minority amongst them were 6 to 7 lakhs, and about over 12 lakh Hindus got left out. So obviously everybody saw the trauma of what happened in Assam, and just with that kind of misery, where people talked of opening huge detention centers to throw those who were non-Indians and non-citizens, got the Muslim community and secular-minded people very agitated. And everybody knew that if you did not have the right documentation, you would have no space. So, I mean, and if in the NPR you could not prove, then you would be declared an illegal migrant. However, but if you were Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, Jain, Christian, Parsi, in 7 years' time, you would get your citizenship in 5 years, sorry, not 7 years. But if you were Muslim, how would you prove your citizenship? And who has documentation in India? And our regular documentation also has so many problems with our spellings, you know, with our age, with our photograph. So it was really, you know, the most horrendous kind of problem that had come to people. I mean, it's not that the Muslims are not being persecuted, not being pushed, but somewhere being now, you know, denied citizenship. The possibility of being denied citizenship was kind of the worst decision of this government. So, I mean, it sent a chill down everybody's spine as to what was happening. So what followed was the youth of the university in Delhi, Jamia Millia Islamia, take the lead, and they took out peaceful protests. But there were massive crackdown that happened on the students. One student even lost his eye in this crackdown. Women were beaten up. Women were being dragged by male police. They got into the masjid of the university. I mean, there was complete mayhem and all boundaries were broken. So it's in this context of complete mayhem that the women of Shaheen Bagh, which is next door to where Jamia Millia Islamia is, they started this most spectacular protest. And it just transformed into a mass movement. It became pan-Indian. And women everywhere, it was Muslim women, mind you, Muslim women everywhere came out to sit in protests. It was literally like what we say in Rajasthan, the Jajam, the carpet of Shaheen Bagh kept being stretched in city after city, in town after town, and women in most of these cities, even small Mufasil towns, came and sat in the most stoic and peaceful day. Of course, there were lots and lots of men also around, but women had started managing. I mean, I can tell you, I traveled to so many Shaheen Bagh protests all over the countries. Women were actually managing. They would decide who could speak or not speak. Of course, the men used to be all around, but definitely there was some sort of leadership in the hands of the women. And they weren't just puppets of men, that because buses, I mean, of course, a lot of arrangements were made for transport in cities where the protests are far away, but women definitely had a lot of agency. Just in Delhi, there were 20 Shaheen Baghs. And the 12 people that we are talking about who have been incarcerated, who were they? They were the leaders of this protest. They were young. I mean, it was mostly, it's not that activists, political parties, eminent personalities, common public did not extend their support. And it was a very hard-hitting kind of protest, but it was led by women, and that was very young women. Of course, there were lots and lots of youth also. Now, it's these protests which led to so much of visibility and so much of, in one way, you know, questioning this whole amendment, that very soon even crackdown started, for instance, in UP, in AMU, for instance, in Lucknow and in other cities of UP. When those people who sat in protest, they were booked under, public property defacing laws, and their photos were put up in central places of the city. And even some of them were even picked up and arrested, many of them, which included retired police officers and journalists and eminent citizens. Even threw them in. It took a judgment of the Allahabad High Court to bring down those banners, but they never came down. It was finally the storm that brought it down. So it was that kind of, crackdown also that had begun. But despite the crackdown, even elite students from IIT, from management institutions who generally never connect. So, I mean, it ceased to be definitely, I mean, the main body of the protest was Muslim, it was women, it was old women, young women, yet it also became a protest of all communities, all sections. And of course, I mean, just the creative way in which the songs and the slogans emerged, and graffiti and art on the roads. It was something very special, something in my career of having been on the streets for the last 40 years. I'd never seen something like that. I have been with the women's movement, but this was something very, very special. And of course, we had women like, just to give one profile, Bilkis Appa, who sat in Shaheen Bagh, over 80, she sat there and she said, we will not allow this to happen, and we will not allow this government to arrest our sons, just release all our sons who are being arrested. I mean, at that time in the crackdown of December 19th, I'm not going into the details. However, we knew that the government at some point would come out. They could not just bear, that there was so much of popularity, so much of public support. So we knew that something or the other would happen. So in the run-up to the Legislative Assembly of the Delhi state, the hate speeches began by the top BJP leaders. One of them is a minister in the Anurag Thakur in the Modi government, and the others, Kapil Mishra, for instance, they straightforward talked of genocide of Muslims, and they wanted, publicly said that, if they don't get up, we know how to, make them get up. And they not only using cuss words against Muslims, but also that they would use force and do anything. I mean, even if there's a bloodbath, they're going to get them evicted. Instead of, restraining them, putting them behind bars, it resulted in some agitation in East Delhi, in Northeast Delhi, of the protesters, and it snowballed into a very, very organized attack on the Muslim protesters in Northeast Delhi, by different groups of, Hindu communities, and they came from outside Delhi. They were actually brought in trucks. Arms are also brought. And that resulted, as we just saw in the video, in a terrible riot. It was not just the loss of lives where 52 people were killed, but just the kind of property that was raised. And this happened just before COVID, and the camps also were not being allowed. And when this riot happened, even ambulances were not allowed. At midnight, activists had to go and wake up the judges to get an order to get the ambulance out. And of course, once this began, this is what the Delhi police, which comes under Home Minister Amit Shah, started, set forth his anti-Muslim agenda. And of course, FIRs to the tune of like 600, 700, total number of FIRs are filed. Some of the FIRs also got filed because you could only be compensated for your property if you had an FIR. However, about 150 FIRs are filed relating to criminal cases, and 50 very serious, of which FIR number 59, of which we're talking, a conspiracy to, somewhere pull down the government, a conspiracy to somewhere attack Modi. And this happened, they tried to use the visit of Trump. They tried to use a speech, which was one of the best speech, which is of Umar Khalid. But they had to somewhere, which I'm sure Banu will talk about, but they had to somewhere vilify the Muslims who had got so much support and popularity. And of course, it just resulted in a siege of Northeast Delhi and many other parts by the police and central forces. It also resulted in, the protests. Finally, where women were made to get up from the protests, and of course they brought the bulldozers a little later and even raised all their structures to the ground. Of course, there was also COVID, and there were COVID guidelines. However, there could have been a dialogue. There could have been all that the women were demanding. They were just not sitting there. They were demanding that talk to us. They kept telling Amit Shah, talk to us. Even in the Supreme Court, it was argued that the government is just not talking to them. However, even the Supreme Court judgment that came really did not help us. So this very unique, spectacular protest led by women, of course, ended in this bloody, and then the might of the state showed its complete might, to remove those women. But I must say that the only silver lining to it was that this whole protest actually resulted in a lot of us learning, building up. We got our confidence back. We realized that we could fight back, and of course, then it's snowballed into that much larger farmers' movement. However, the cases that they made and the large number of people, definitely those who went under the terror laws, the 12 there were a total of 21. 3 were released without UAPA right in the beginning. 18 were taken under UAPA, of which 2 have got bail. It's sad that 16 still remain incarcerated, and we just don't know when the trial will start. Actually, it's the process which is the punishment. There is no desire to start any trial ever. It's just to bring trunk loads of paper and confuse the judges. And also, although we got a very good judgment when 3 people were released, Natasha Narwal and Asif Iqbal Tanha and Devangana Kalita, whoever, I'm sure Shahrukh will talk about the jurisprudence that emerged, relating to the right to association and my right to protest, which is not anti-national. In a democracy, if I don't have the right to protest, then where is it a democracy? That, of course, is not being used enough by the courts again to get the people out. I close here that the women of India, that also Muslim women of India, so-called illiterate backward women of India, who were in hijab and pardas, actually broke the silence of the kind of persecutions that people in India are going through. And they paved the way for what, for a while, we regained our democracy. However, today, before I conclude, the way the Muslims are being pushed into the background with the might of the state, mass raids, arrests to the tune of 300 to 400 PFI activists, now a ban on the PFI, the Popular Front of India. The right to association is once again thrown into the air, completely anti-constitutional ban, but the persecution of Muslims is just unending and is going to continue. However, the anti-CAA protest gives us the hope that we can fight back. The farmers' protest gives us the hope that we can fight back.
Thank you so much, Kavita, for your valuable commentary. Our next speaker is Audrey Trushke, who is a historian and an associate professor at Rutgers University. Her work focuses on medieval South Asia. Professor Trushke is immensely brave and courageous. As our viewers know, for years, she has been relentlessly attacked by Hindu extremists on Twitter, who have sent her the vilest threats of physical violence and harm, including to her family. Her book, The Medieval Mughal Emperor of India, has been a bestseller and widely hailed. She has also thoroughly exposed Hindu right-wing ideology and its politics. For her views, she has also faced a lawsuit from Hindu American Foundation. Audrey, please take it away.
Thank you so much. It's truly my honor to be with you all today. I want to hit in my remarks on sort of 3 basic points. The first is that the CAA, the bill that we're talking about, is quite consistent with Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, which is a hateful ideology with global impacts. The second point I want to discuss is how the CAA contributes to remaking India from a democracy into an ethno-nationalist state with very strong authoritarian marks. And then third, I'll sort of close by just commenting on some of what this looks like from a United States perspective. Okay, and all of this is sort of pursuant to placing the CAA and the anti-CAA protests in a slightly broader context. So let me begin with Hindutva. Okay, Hindutva or Hindu nationalism is the official policy of the BJP. Okay, the BJP is a far-right ultra-nationalist party that currently leads India. The core idea of Hindutva is that to be Indian and to be Hindu are one in the same. Okay, and this is an expression of ethno-nationalism that is so extreme that many scholars consider Hindutva to be a form of fascism. That's historically accurate. Hindutva's early articulators were inspired by fascist movements in early 20th century Germany and Italy. Early Hindutva ideologues even openly praised Hitler's treatment of the Jews. Now, I mentioned that for a reason, namely that there's always an other in fascist thought, and that other has to be hated and demonized relentlessly in order to define the self. And for Hindutva ideologues, the other are Muslims. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Hindu nationalism depends upon hatred of Muslims. So there is no benign Hindu nationalism in our world. There are stronger and weaker articulations of this ideology, but the bedrock is consistently fierce anti-Muslim sentiment. And so when we think about policies like the CAA, an openly discriminatory law, this is not an extension, this is not some sort of outgrowth or bad apples or things got out of hand. This is simply the logical next step that is reflective of far deeper, more central Hindutva bigotries. Now, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and this is turning to my second point, it is supposed to bring India one step closer to being what Hindu nationalists sometimes term the Hindu Rashtra. Okay, that means Hindu state, a Hindu homeland. This would be a nation of India by Hindus for Hindus, in which all other religions are second-class citizens. Now, the Hindu Rashtra is a project well underway. And honestly, India is authoritarian by most metrics that are commonly used. Okay, their human rights record has tanked in recent years. Their freedom of press has fallen off of a cliff. The state oppresses minorities as a matter of course. Honestly, we have probably already lost Indian democracy. Just this week, India's Minister of External Affairs suggested that we must consider India a democracy regardless of how people vote. That's a euphemism for authoritarianism, except it's not really euphemistic. Now, in the burgeoning Hindu Rashtra, dissent is criminalized. Okay, you're not supposed to dissent, and Islamophobia is normalized. And so what does that look like? Right? What does it look like to be a Muslim in India right now? So in some parts of India, Muslims have been stripped of their citizenship through the National Register of Citizens. And Kavita talked a little bit about that in Assam. The government has even begun building concentration camps to house the newly stateless. Freedom of religion is restricted. Some mosques cannot issue the call to prayer. In parts of India, Muslim women are barred from covering their heads in public schools. And what of politics? If you oppose the government's Hindutva activities and you happen to be Muslim, you may very well have your house bulldozed, absent any legal proceedings. The bulldozer has become a crude symbol of Hindutva aggression across the world. Some Muslims are incarcerated for years without a trial, sometimes even without charges. We're here to discuss some of those. Other Muslims are lynched on the streets for eating beef, for false accusations of eating beef, or for loving somebody of a different religion. Now, the Citizenship Amendment Act is one piece of this far larger project, but it's a particularly important piece, which is why we saw such brutal crackdowns on protesters against the CAA between December of 2019 and February of 2020. Okay, and Kavita did a great job covering that. Let me just note that some of the atrocities involved in the crackdown, including assaults on students and a pogrom that killed more than 50 in Delhi in February of 2020, were documented by local authorities. Okay, but those local authorities, civil rights groups, human rights activists, work at a huge risk in India. Right? They can be imprisoned themselves. Many international human rights groups have been kicked out of the country and can no longer operate in India. And that's because if you're the BJP and you're going to try to turn the world's largest democracy into the world's largest authoritarian state, you probably want as little attention as possible on you while you do that. And so sort of in closing, let me just turn briefly to my third point, right? Just a little bit on what this looks like from a US perspective. Okay, the US has fairly good relations with India. And those relations, as I understand it, are built upon the idea that we, India and the United States, the two nations, share an interest in democracy and in fostering multiculturalism and freedom in our respective countries. But at present, the idea of shared values, it looks more like a dream. Okay, it's contradicted by the brutal Hindutva reality of oppression on the ground in India. And US officials have taken note of this. In a fairly rare rebuke in June of this year, Secretary of State Blinken said, "We've seen rising attacks on people in places of worships in India." And he singled out that some Indian officials are ignoring or even supporting these assaults on religious freedom. This sort of attention is important, but the BJP is relatively unlikely to change course, right, because of their bedrock of Hindutva. Now, that will certainly have foreign policy ramifications, but let me just note that we also have problems here at home. Okay, the BJP has allies in the United States. Some are registered foreign agents, such as overseas friends of the BJP. In other cases, Hindu nationalist groups like the HSS, the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, and the VHPA, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, operate as nonprofits, but they promote Hindutva hate, which leads to aggressions against Indian Muslims in the United States and also leads to the dissemination of disinformation among Asian American communities. Okay, both of those are growing problems right now. It's a bitter reminder that Hindutva ideology is global, okay? And it plays out very differently in different nations, depending on the strength of the rule of law and civil society. But the anti-Muslim hate and the desire to oppress a religious minority dubbed as irrevocably other, that is consistent and it is horrifying. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Audrey. We continue to pray for your safety and security. The Indian American community deeply appreciates and supports your courage in calling out bigotry and hate-filled ideology of Hindu supremacism. Our next speaker is Shahrukh Alam, a widely respected lawyer with India's Supreme Court. As a lawyer, Alam has been in the forefront of defending constitutional liberties by taking up cases that few lawyers dare to accept. She has studied law and sociology. Shahrukh, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm basically only going to reiterate what Audrey said in a much less erudite way. But I also have three broad points to make. The first is that, like Kavita pointed out, the CAA was broadly trying to reconfigure citizenship status of people. So people who were earlier secure in their citizenship of India suddenly felt that it may be reconfigured. But my argument is that in the aftermath of the riots and in the aftermath of the protests, basically all these criminal cases and the logic of the prosecution therein does exactly that. It manages to reconfigure the citizenship status of people. And it does it in three ways. First, it lays down permissible limits for participatory citizenship. So it tells you very clearly what you can do as a citizen of India and what you cannot do. And what you cannot do is the following. You cannot hold political articulations that the ruling dispensation does not approve of. Certain political positions are dangerous. You can't hold those political positions. And they're very much considered to be outside the purview of civic action. So as a citizen, you can't participate in certain political ideas, in certain kinds of political thought. Two, the logic of the prosecution lays down very clearly who is a good citizen and who is an unruly subject. An unruly subject is someone who's forever questioning, who's critical of the regime, who's constantly challenging the neat narratives of development, of whatever it is. And the good citizen is someone who's reiterating it, who's coming out for the nationalist cause, and who's reiterating both discursively on social media by trolling people like Audrey, and also out into the streets, reiterating the nationalist majoritarian narrative. And third of all, what the logic of the prosecution does is it normalizes corrective action by the good citizens against the unruly subject. So it is okay for the good citizen, it is okay for the nationalist citizen to go out and either discursively or even physically correct the behavior of the unruly subject. And also the blame for such kind of retaliatory violence shifts from the good citizen who's actually indulging in such violence onto the unruly subject. The popular logic is that by indulging in these anti-national disruptive activities, you're calling it upon yourself. You're actually causing other people to retaliate violently on you. And in this regard, the logic of the prosecution now has traveled much beyond these criminal cases. It has now become the popular common sense of the Indian people. Our foreign minister was recently in Washington and he was addressing the diaspora there. And some of the diaspora are American citizens. So oddly, he first conceded that the space for debate, he called it, the space for debate in India has shrunk. And then he said that therefore those people who can't now debate in India are using international fora, the US mainstream media and such other fora, to lay out their views. And again, he confused or he misinterpreted criticism of policy for criticism of country, which is not the case. But that's how he put it. And then he invited the diaspora to intervene in corrective measures. So he said, when you see somebody doing this, come out and correct them. And that is again calling on the good citizen to correct the unruly subject, to come out and to do it discursively, to do it on social media or to do it on the streets. That is the first part of what I had to say. The second part is this, that before FIR 59 of 2020, which lays the basis of the logic of the prosecution, violence was always a crime. And in terms of protest violence, there's a very, very particular test, and that is called the spark in a powder keg. So if a situation is tense, if a situation is charged, and you go and you make a speech, that is like a spark in a powder keg, that is very directly insightful of violence, then you would be booked, then you would be guilty of having committed an offense. But there has to be an immediate and causal link between the speech and the act of violence. That is one. The second is that any violent act conducted by an unlawful assembly is punishable in law. But again, you have to show that the assembly actually committed a violent act and you were part of an unlawful assembly. And the police has very specific powers to either disperse an unlawful assembly or to detain some members of that unlawful assembly temporarily and to charge them for misdemeanors. But the anti-CAA protests have not been framed according to these applicable laws. They have not been framed as breach of peace in the moment, an unlawful assembly damaging property or an unlawful assembly hurting someone or causing traffic inconvenience. That's not how they've been framed. They have been framed as something more spectacular, as something more conspiratorial, as something much more serious than a simple misdemeanor. And this is where FIR 59 of 2020 comes in. It was registered by a sub-inspector of the Delhi police, and he said that he has informers who have informed him that this is a deep-rooted conspiracy. And what is the conspiracy, pray? The conspiracy is, A, to embarrass the Indian government in front of President Trump, who was visiting at the time. Now, we know President Trump and concerns about self-image have resolved themselves in time, but we leave that aside for now. The second more serious charge was that there was a conspiracy to internationally further a political propaganda that minorities in India are oppressed. Now, I've never known an FIR, a first information report, to describe a political assertion as propaganda. It may or may not be, but it's not a crime, it's not an offense. So a political assertion, whether it is propaganda or not, is not an offense. But that is the beginning of FIR 59. It says that these people are indulging in political propaganda. And that is how it is framed. Now, interestingly, FIR 59 does not make any allegations about the assembly of protesters having incited violence or having been violent themselves. So the FIR is actually silent about who committed violence, where did the violence come from. And yet, the whole assembly of protesters is booked under Section 147 of the Indian Penal Code, which is rioting. So without having indulged in violence, without having been any allegation of violence, the single collective assembly of protesters is termed a rioting agent. And that is how it's seen in popular sentiment. Assembly of protesters, anti-CAA protesters, rioters. Although there's no allegation of violence anywhere, it's just an allegation that they were out on the streets, suggesting to an international audience that we are being oppressed. Now, the entire prosecution case does not answer two basic legal questions. One, who actually committed the violence? Who caused the riots? And two, was there at any point of time any causal link between the protesters and the rioters? Were the protesters the rioters or not? The prosecution does not answer these two basic questions. So the link between the arc of violence is drawn from the position that retaliation or corrective violence had to happen. You invited it. By protesting, you invited it. So therefore, the blame for the retaliatory violence is upon you. And that is the prosecution case, which is legally completely untenable. Now, on the other hand, I'll read out bits from the prosecution case in the trial of Umar Khalid's bail. The prosecution says of Umar that he conspired to provide Muslims an articulation of their grievances and a methodology for its articulation. Now, this methodology for articulation is not even violent. It's a means of protesting on the streets, but that is the prosecution's case. Two, Umar created a critical mass of Muslim protesters, communalized political space, and excited violence. Not invited violence, but excited violence from the other side, who saw Muslims getting together in an assembly and were so excited that they had to indulge in corrective or retaliatory violence. And last of all, the prosecution case says that the grievances are false, fabricated, and funded by external agencies. So it's all propaganda. And again, reading on, similarly in the case of Asif and Natasha and Devangana in their bail hearing, the prosecution's case was that they visited Muslim majority and Muslim dominated areas and campaigned as part of protests in these areas. They coordinated with imams. This is the case against them. And they organized a mob of a particular community. The prosecution repeatedly refers to Muslims or the protesters as a mob without any allegation of violence on their part. So then the assembly in itself becomes dangerous, even when it's not violent, even when there's no incitement to violence. Just the fact that they've been mobilized as a Muslim around their Muslim identity and they're protesting makes them dangerous and it makes them violent. And the last point, Section 15 of the UAPA, this is the special act that they've all been booked under, Section 15 defines a terrorist act. It says whoever does any act with intent to threaten or likely to threaten the unity, integrity, security, or sovereignty of India, etc. And this is important. Whoever does this by using bombs or dynamite or other explosive substances or lethal weapons or poisonous or noxious gases will be considered to have indulged in a terrorist act. Now, please see, it says they must have used bombs or dynamite or explosive substances or lethal weapons or poisonous or noxious gases. It's not even the prosecution case that any of this was used. But what the prosecution is suggesting is that the bare bodies of Muslim women and Muslim children and Muslim men, by being out on the street, was noxious in itself, was a lethal weapon in itself. It was a terrorist act in itself to be out on the street with the identity of being a Muslim and having mobilized as a Muslim. So what it is it is a pro-establishment political logic, but a completely untenable legal case. And the Delhi High Court, while granting bail to Asif and Devangna and Natasha in this very case, said exactly that. And I'm quoting from the Delhi High Court judgment. It said, "We are of the view that the foundations of our nation stand on much surer footing than to likely be shaken by a protest, however vicious, organized by a tribe of college students or other persons." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shahrukh, for those insightful comments. Let us now hear from the family members of two of these prisoners of conscience. First is Shama Parveen, the sister of youth leader Miran Haider, who is in prison. Miran is a PhD research scholar at New Delhi's prestigious university, the Jamia Millia Islamia.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम। मैं मिरान हैदर की बड़ी बहन। मेरा भाई मिरान हैदर हक और इंसाफ की आवाज़ उठाने की वजह से तकरीबन 2.5 साल से तिहाड़ जेल में कैद है। मैं यकीन के साथ कह सकती हूँ कि मेरा भाई बेकसूर है, उसे झूठे मुकदमे में फंसाया गया है। मिरान जब जामिया के स्कूल का तालिब इल्म था, तब से मैं लोकल गार्जियन होने की वजह से उसके ख्यालात और रुझान से बखूबी वाकिफ हूँ। ज़रूरतमंद स्टूडेंट की हेल्प करना और ज़रूरतमंदों की मदद करना, ज़रूरतमंदों के साथ खड़े रहना, लोगों का ताउन करना, समाज का सेवा करना, ये उनको फौकियत देता था। जामिया से इंजीनियरिंग करने के बावजूद किसी कंपनी में नौकरी नहीं किया। वो सोचता था कि नौकरी करके सिर्फ मैं अपनी फैमिली के लिए कुछ कर सकता हूँ और समाज सेवा का मौका न मिलता। इसी रुझान के तहत सोशल स्ट्रीम में एमफिल करने के बाद पीएचडी में एडमिशन लिया ताकि समाज से जुड़ा रहूं और उनकी सेवा कर सकूं। मिरान के जामिया में पीएचडी के दौरान सरकार ने सीए का एनआरसी का काला कानून लाया और इस काले कानून के खिलाफ लोगों ने आवाज उठाया। जामिया के बच्चों ने भी कानून के दायरे में रहकर प्रोटेस्ट किया। इसी वजह से जामिया के दीगर तुलबा के साथ मेरा भाई मिरान हैदर को भी दिल्ली दंगों के झूठे मुकदमे में फंसाया गया। जबकि सच्चाई ये है कि दिल्ली के जिन इलाकों में दंगा हुआ वहां मेरा भाई कभी गया ही नहीं और न उसका किसी तरह का कोई रोल रहा। उसको सिर्फ दंगे में ही नहीं फंसाया गया बल्कि यूपीए जैसे सख्त धारा भी उस पर लगाया गया। मेरे वालिद मोहतरम जो वालदा के इंतकाल के सदमे से अभी बाहर नहीं निकल पाए थे, तभी मिरान को झूठे मुकदमे में फंसाया जाना और उसको जेल में डालना उनको पहाड़ सा मुसीबत आ पड़ा। इस सदमे से टूट गए हैं। इस मुसीबत की वजह से वो बूढ़े ही नहीं हुए बल्कि कई बीमारियों के भी मरीज हो गए हैं। चूंकि मिरान का बेल एप्लीकेशन अदालत में ज़ेर बहस है, वो मिरान की बेल रिहाई की उम्मीद और नाउम्मीदी के सबब रात भर नहीं सो पाते हैं। गर्चे मिरान पर यूपीए जैसे सख्त कानून लगाया गया है, लेकिन मुझे अदालत से उम्मीद है कि जल्द से जल्द मिरान को इंसाफ मिलेगा।
That was Shama Parveen, Miran Haider's sister. Our next speaker is Bana Joyatsna Lahiri, who is a Delhi-based feminist activist and researcher. She is also Umar Khalid's partner, one of the 12 prisoners of conscience. Dozens of international celebrities, including Professor Noam Chomsky, have publicly demanded his release. Umar is associated with United Against Hate, a campaign founded by activists, intellectuals, and students to combat hate crimes and mob violence. Bana Joyatsna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Husna. I hope I'm audible. Thank you so much, everyone, my co-panelists, and thank you for letting me speak here. My previous speakers have already told you about the CAA and the equal citizenship movement at large. Now, the beauty of that anti-CAA movement and the equal citizenship protesters is that although it was one of the biggest and most peaceful civil disobedience movement since independence in this country that India has ever witnessed, there was no centralized leadership. It was a beautifully democratic, decentralized and localized movement. Now, my friend Umar Khalid is an activist who addressed many of these gatherings across the country. And all the people, all the 12 and the other 18 people that we are talking about today in this case, they were all ardent equal citizenship activists, and they all protested against the religious discrimination determining citizenship that has never happened in India. But then so did lakhs of others. All of us, if that is a crime, then all of us are criminals. Lakhs of people protested against that, but I think the entire case is actually a way to silence all of us. It's a way to intimidate all of us who participated in that historic movement. It is therefore these people are today behind bars, and it's been going on, and the prosecution, as Advocate Shahrukh Alam so beautifully described, the prosecution could not make its case, but yet they are languishing behind bars. And that is the truth right now. The point is the Delhi riots, when it took place between 23rd to 25th of February, it was largely anti-Muslim. The majority killed and injured were Muslims. 7 mosques in the area where the riots took place were gutted, although not a single place of worship of the Hindus were harmed. So you can understand that it was an anti-Muslim riot, and around 750 FIRs, first information reports, were filed for different cases, out of which 1 FIR was turned into the conspiracy. Now, a riot where more than 50 people were killed, when the prosecution, the state, the Delhi police are pursuing the conspiracy of that riot, it's only focused on the equal citizenship protesters. It's turning a complete blind eye towards the other people, which other speakers have already mentioned, who gave open calls for genocides against Muslims. And therefore, right from the beginning, this case is a case of vendetta. It's a case of vindictiveness. And my friend Umar, as well as all the others, are victims of that. This case itself is the conspiracy, right? If there is a conspiracy, it is this case, this FIR 59. It's the biggest conspiracy, which is persecuting these 18 people, as well as trying to intimidate everyone else who spoke for the constitution. If I just focus on Umar's case, how it started. On March 2nd, after the riots had happened and it had stopped, on March 2nd, Amit Malviya, the head of the BJP IT cell, tweeted a 40-second clip of a speech by Umar that he had delivered in Amravati, Maharashtra, which is around 1200 kilometers away from Delhi. In this speech, in that clip that Amit Malviya tweeted, Umar was heard saying that when Donald Trump comes to India on 24th of March, we will protest and let the world know that things are not fine in India. Now, as Shahrukh Alam had beautifully pointed out, that is not any kind of call for violence. That is a call for protest. And that also happened in Maharashtra, that in one speech, he mentioned this. What Mr. Amit Malviya did not mention is that in the same speech, Umar had upheld Mahatma Gandhi and his ideology. Umar had explicitly said that we will not reply violence with violence. Umar had also said that this is a beautiful movement that's upholding the constitution of the country, and that is how we are going to fight. He had explicitly said that, you know, Mahatma Gandhi has given us two weapons, which are satyagraha and ahimsa, that is non-violence and civil disobedience. And this is what this movement is. The protests, that was the beauty of the anti-CAA protests. But that 40 seconds clip that Amit Malviya had tweeted with a clear political purpose. Now I understand where he is coming from. He is the head of the BJP IT cell, so he has that compulsion to give it a political twist. The unfortunate part is, the moment Amit Malviya tweeted that thing, there was an explosion in the media. Okay, all the media started parroting what exactly Amit Malviya has been saying and not giving the entire context. They, in a way, they doctored that clip because they did not include the parts where he was talking about, explicitly talking about non-violence and satyagraha and remain peaceful. So that this cannot be a call for riot. They did not report it. More unfortunately is when the prosecution, which is the state, okay, the state also repeated that same line of argument in the entire FIR 59 and the subsequent charge sheet, which ran 17,000 pages of utterly projecting these people, the protesters, as the conspirators for riot. And as Advocate Alam said, that there was no causal connection between the actual violence and this protest. But these protests itself were criminalized, and there Umar's speech was pegged as the main evidence against him. Now, when he was arrested on 13 September 2020, when Umar was arrested, next day he was produced in the court for the first time. The public prosecutor said that we have 11 lakh pages of evidence against Umar. 2 years down the line, we have not seen those 11 lakh pages. What they have only presented in court are that one speech of Umar, where he gives explicit call for non-violence. That is pegged as the, you know, the center of conspiracy against him, and some statements by protected witnesses, and the fact that he was part of the protest. That is enough to criminalize. And ultimately this FIR 59, which started with bailable offenses, right? It was turned into, by May, it was turned into a terror case when 4 sections of the UAPA were included. Now, that is, so my point is that what Mr. Amit Malviya, the ball that he had set rolling was picked up by the media and then picked up by the prosecution. And when while doing the charge sheet, when the police had gone to the media houses that you had reported about this speech of Umar, so give us your affidavits about you know how you received the speech and you reported about the speech. And the media, all the media houses squarely said that no, we saw the tweet of Amit Malviya and that is the source of our information. So the entire source of information of this narrative is set by the head of the IT cell of BJP, and that's how shallow this case is. But the thing is that 2 years have gone by and most of the people who were hounded are still behind bars, and they are all fighting for even bail. Like the trial of the case has not started, they are just seeking bail, and that even that is denied to most of them. The point is that Umar was implicated in 2 FIRs, in FIR 101 and FIR 59. All the other protesters were also implicated in multiple FIRs. The thing is that almost all of them have got bail in all other cases. Now, all these FIRs, it's not like they were pursuing very different or variant narrative about the conspiracy. They were giving the same material. There were overlapping witness statements, and the same narrative that, you know, the anti-CAA protests led to the riots without showing any causal connection. Now, in all other cases, everyone almost have got bail. But in this 159, the case, the FIR 59, which is under UAPA, the bail is not being secured. And because getting bail under UAPA is so much difficult, so that everyone is languishing, almost everyone is languishing. Already already it's been told about the particular case, and so I'm not going into the details of the FIR or the charge sheet. I'll just mention two things. That additional sessions judge Vinod Yadav, while he granted bail to Umar in FIR 101, said that Khalid could not be allowed to remain behind bars on the basis of sketchy material against him. So it's the court which has said that, the materials are extremely sketchy, and you cannot let anyone be behind bars. So by the same logic, in FIR 59 also, they should have gotten bail. Last year, like Shahrukh mentioned, that there was a very good order which granted bail to Devangana, Natasha and Asif. And by parity, others also should have gotten bail. But the Supreme Court stayed that judgment. That judgment, unfortunately, could not be used by the co-accused. They said that since that judgment makes very strong observations against the use of UAPA and the way the prosecution has criminalized protesters, there are very serious observations which require further scrutiny. So the Supreme Court also did not cancel the bail of the activists, but they said that you cannot apply for parity for other co-accused. So other people in other cases had evoked this judgment, this bail order, to secure bail in UAPA, but unfortunately we cannot. So we are basically caught in this legal conundrum, and therefore we are waiting for bail. For Umar's case right now, the arguments in High Court are over, and the judgment is reserved, and we are waiting for the bail. I'll just bring to your notice one thing that has happened in the meantime. That one case is going on in the Indian court of law. The other case, a more vicious, a vitriolic case, is going on in the Indian media. The media trial is something that has become a menace in India right now. And we are all facing that, we are all victims of that menace, particularly targeting Umar. Amongst all of them, Umar has always been the target of media and a section of the mainstream media. Like I said, when Amit Malviya tweeted, they did not bother to cross-check. Even when the prosecution submitted the supplementary charge sheet after Umar was arrested, even before Umar's lawyer got a copy of the charge sheet, Umar got a copy of the charge sheet, even before the charge sheet was placed in court on record. This charge sheet was linked to the media. And what the media did was that they cherry-picked statements of people that they have made in police custody. Now, by Indian Penal Code, statements made in police custody has no legal value as evidences. You cannot put statements that were made in police custody as evidences in the court of law in India. Now, but these media houses, they did not, give those disclaimers, did not clarify, did not say that, these are statements made in the police custody, therefore they have no value. Anyone can be intimidated to say anything in the police custody. But they started quoting those media, those statements in the media, and tried to show that, there is undeniable evidences against Umar Khalid about his involvement in the riots because so and so had said, and that became the evidence. Now that is not an evidence. That is not an evidence in the court of law. But Indian media started parroting that. Now the problem is that now after 1 year, in between, the court also, Magistrate Dinesh Kumar, he passed an order condemning this media trial, this vicious media trial, saying that it seriously jeopardizes the right to fair trial of the accused. And after 1 year now, the National Broadcasting and Digital Standards Authorities had actually had passed an order against 5 news channels and asked them to remove 5 news outlets that they had aired last year. But the point is, for 1 year, that vicious media trial had continued. Now those are removed, but they had remained in 1 year. They create opinion, and that is what we are fighting. That is what we are fighting for. All the activists behind bar, that there is a parallel media trial that is going on that puts their security, their life, their limb under immense. They make them vulnerable. And you know, this is not the first time Umar is facing that. In 2016 also, once he was arrested on the charge of sedition. That time also there was a huge media campaign. He was particularly targeted because he is an outspoken Muslim voice who is fearless.
We do need to wrap up.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what I'm saying, that he survived an assassination attempt on him because of this media trial, and all the people who are right now incarcerated are facing this. So these two trials are going on. We still have our hope on the Indian media, Indian judiciary, and we think that justice will be delivered. But the world community really needs to speak up, because we need to also match the cacophony of the media trial that's going on. Thank you. Thank you for having me once again.
Thank you so much, Banajowitz. Now, we are praying for an early release and acquittal for Umar, as well as the others who have been unjustly imprisoned in this case. Next up, we have a video from Shamsad Ahmed, who is the father of Shadab Ahmed, another prisoner of conscience. Shadab is 27 years old. He too has been targeted for his leadership in the protest against the CAA.
के अंदर मैं हूँ, मेरी बीवी है और मेरी अम्मा है और मेरे 5 बच्चे हैं, जिसमें 3 बेटी है और 2 बेटे। बेटों में बड़ा बेटा मेरा शादाब है, जॉब करते करते वो जो है जंतर मंतर पर जो CNRC में प्रदर्शन में गया है, और जगतपुर में भी जाता था, जमा मस्जिद पर भी गया है, और वो जो है साइन बाग भी गया है, और वो चांद बाग भी जाता था। और इसी बीच में जो है उसके बाद जो है मेरे बेटे को, उसी टाइम के बाद मेरे बेटे को जो है बुलाया गया। मेरा बेटा खुद गया वहां पर, जब उन्होंने बुलाया तभी गया, और 4-5 बुलाने के बाद बुलाकर उससे पूछताछ करने के बाद उसको छोड़ दिया। 6ठी बार में उसको रोका 2020 और 5वां महीने को उसको रोक दिया गया, और रोकने के बाद उसको
I'm sorry, we have some technical difficulties and cannot see the video, so I'm just going to start it up again.
के अंदर मैं हूँ, मेरी बीवी है और मेरी अम्मा है और मेरे 5 बच्चे हैं, जिसमें 3 बेटी है और 2 बेटे। बेटों में बड़ा बेटा मेरा शादाब है, जॉब करते करते वो जो है जंतर मंतर पर जो CNRC में प्रदर्शन में गया है, और जगतपुर में भी जाता था, जमा मस्जिद पर भी गया है, और वो जो है साइन बाग भी गया है, और वो चांद बाग भी जाता था। और इसी बीच में जो है उसके बाद जो है मेरे बेटे को, उसी टाइम के बाद मेरे बेटे को जो है बुलाया गया। मेरा बेटा खुद गया वहां पर, जब उन्होंने बुलाया तभी गया, और 4-5 बुलाने के बाद बुलाकर उससे पूछताछ करने के बाद उसको छोड़ दिया। 6ठी बार में उसको रोका 2020 और 5वां महीने को उसको रोक दिया गया, और रोकने के बाद उसको ऊपर मुकदमे लगा दिए गए। मेरे बेटे ने कुछ ऐसा काम नहीं किया जो इसके ऊपर मुकदमे लगा दिए, ना उसने संविधान के दायरे के में रह करके लोकतंत्र को बचाने के लिए और इस देश के संविधान को बचाने के लिए के दायरे में उसने प्रोटेस्ट किया है। और प्रोटेस्ट करना तो ये तो हमारा अधिकार है, कोई उसने गलत नहीं किया, ना किसी के खिलाफ बोला है, ना किसी को उल्टा सीधा कहा है, सिर्फ उसने प्रोटेस्ट में शामिल होता। और मेरे बेटे के ऊपर मुकदमे लगा दिए गए, जबकि मेरे बेटे ने ऐसा कोई काम नहीं किया, ना उसका कोई ऐसा पिछला इतिहास है ऐसा कि उसने कोई गलत काम किया हो। मेरा बेटा पढ़ करने के बाद जॉब किया, जॉब करते करते उसने प्रोटेस्ट किया, और प्रोटेस्ट के अंदर भी उसने कोई ऐसी बात नहीं बोली जो संविधान के खिलाफ हो, जो देश विद्रोह के खिलाफ हो, जो देश के खिलाफ कोई बात बोली हो, या किसी नेता के खिलाफ बोली हो, या किसी भ्रम के खिलाफ बोली हो, किसी चीज के खिलाफ मेरे बेटे ने कोई ऐसी बात नहीं बोली और उसके खिलाफ जो है मुकदमे लगा दिए और मेरा बेटा कमाबेश 2 साल 4 महीने लगभग जेल में बंद और मेरे कोई ऐसा जरिया नहीं है। तो मेरे साथ तो मेरा सहारा था, मेरा बड़ा बेटा था, छोटा बेटा भी मेरा पढ़ता है। तो मुझे परेशानी तो है मेरी जिंदगी में, मगर इस जिंदगी में उसके बावजूद मैं बस झेल रहा हूँ और मेरी जिंदगी गुजर रही है और मैं 62 साल से भी ऊपर का हो चुका हूँ।
So that, of course, was Shamsad Ahmad, the father of one of the prisoners of conscience. And now we are going to have our final speaker today, Mr. Govind Acharya. He is the India and Kashmir specialist for Amnesty International USA and has held a variety of roles over the years in Amnesty International, including serving in the board of directors. As our audience knows, Govind is a regular presence on our briefings and is tremendously knowledgeable about India's persecution of human rights defenders and social and religious minorities. Govind.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, a lot of people have already spoken about some of the specifics, but I've been asked to talk about what the global community response to the human rights violations are or is, or what is lacking in there, and what, more specifically, what you all can do to help. And it's essential to understand this, but I just want to first quickly thank the people who spoke before me, not just for sharing their thoughts, but also for their courage and also acknowledging the pain of those who have been negatively impacted in so many ways because of this crisis. And it's very easy for people who aren't jailed, who are living free, to just forget about those who are in jail. It's also very easy to dismiss them as somehow deserving their fate. Yet others kind of poo-poo these attacks on human rights as not political at all, but just rather letting the law take its course. I mean, that is a very common sentiment as well. This latter perspective is also one that I have heard has been offered by Indian diplomats, at least in Washington, to at least a couple of US members of Congress who have raised concerns of their constituents. And sorry for my language here, but those claims by the Indian diplomats is frankly BS. It's meant to be dismissive. The decision to arrest and jail activists is obviously a conscious effort to silence dissenters. I was thinking, Arundhati Roy, of course, a very famous author and activist, she has so many wonderful, quotable things. And one of the things I think she said that's particularly apt here is there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And that is the goal. And we actually must make sure that those who are deliberately silenced or unheard are actually heard. But on the other hand, we have to say, well, given that the Indian diplomats are at least forced to offer platitudes over letting a judicial process play out, it means that pressure is probably happening somewhere, but it's not enough. As Shahriar Kalam noted earlier, we see that Indian government officials are also asking US supporters of the Indian government's policies to push back against those who are in the US raising human rights concerns. So we really can't let up, and we have to keep applying that pressure. Now, we're told by government officials in the US and other countries that they are raising our concerns, but it's private and it's quiet diplomacy, as it were. But we don't know how specific it is or how forceful it is. For example, there's a big difference between saying that India and the US or Germany or France share a rich history of democracy and human rights, which I've seen in many press statements when there are bilateral meetings, versus saying that those who are arrested for expressing their views are being unjustly jailed and should be released immediately. There's a big difference in that. It's frustrating to many, it's frustrating to me actually, because it doesn't seem as though anything is happening. It's an uphill battle, and we really shouldn't sugarcoat that uphill battle. But then on the other hand, as I said, maybe the quiet diplomacy is having an impact. Let's say, to put a positive spin on it, maybe the pressure is in fact preventing even worse things from happening. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just saying that perhaps. But this is actually where you come in, the members of the people who are listening, other panelists, and regular people who are living their lives in the US and in other countries. Your voice can add pressure on the governments around the world to get them to raise your concerns over these and other human rights violations in India. Now, you can join a protest or vigil organizing by groups that are co-sponsoring this briefing, of course. I encourage you to do that. You could sign a petition when they put out a petition on a particular issue. You could donate money. You can volunteer your time with one of these organizations. But you can also do a lot of things as well in your community. And there are probably people in this briefing from several different countries, and I'm mainly speaking about the US or Canada to some extent. And if you're living outside of India, you can actually have an influence. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a hard slog, but you can have an impact. The most direct impact, if you live in the US or Canada or some other countries, is to contact your member of the US House or your Canadian MP, contact them by phone. And one piece of advice is call the local office of your representative first. Now, you're not going to meet the member, of course, right away. And the person you talk to will almost certainly have no idea what you're talking about. The only thing they know about India is that Mahatma Gandhi was from there, and yoga is from there. But otherwise, you educate them, and it's again a slow process. But you will be able to build a connection with the constituent staff and educate them using the points raised in this briefing or raised in points from human rights and civil society organizations around. And at first, again, you were not going to get that far, but keep talking to them and keep raising those concerns. Build credibility and don't exaggerate. Just stick to the facts there. And so by doing this slog of work in your community, you're building a constituency of people who care about human rights in India, and it'll have a cumulative effect. So you're for one meeting with an intern in your local office is not going to have an immediate impact, but over time you will build that constituency, and it can have an impact, and a slow going and very much worth it. And I'll leave it at that. But I think that the key here is to just constantly apply the pressure wherever you live on your government, because they're working for you, and ask them to raise these issues. And the hope is that it'll have an impact in India, a very positive impact. So I'll leave it there. Again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Govind, for your encouragement and your calls to action. And thank you to all of the panelists who joined and everyone watching this very important on this very important topic. We hope and pray that these prisoners of conscience will be granted fair trials and will be released. That is all of the time we have for this week's congressional briefing. I would like to thank the co-organizers of this briefing: Genocide Watch, World Without Genocide, Indian American Muslim Council, Hindus for Human Rights, International Christian Concern, Jubilee Campaign, 21 Wilberforce, Dalit Solidarity Forum, New York State Council of Churches, Federation of Indian American Christian Organizations of North America, India Civil Watch International, Center for Pluralism, American Muslim Institution, Students Against Hindutva Ideology, International Society for Peace and Justice, the Humanism Project, and Association of Indian Muslims of America. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.